your presence at this panel. Got the honor of introducing and moderating the panel. We have three presenters. One of our presenters was unable to make it today. Laila Taraji will not be presenting. The panel is titled Expressions of Displacement. And we have the good fortune of having Professor Aseel Sawalha with us, Riyad Shahjahan, Professor Riyad Shahjahan, and Ms. Hanan Ali. I'll introduce each of them before they give their papers, and we'll be going in the order that they're listed in the program. So let's begin with Aseel's paper. Aseel is an associate professor of anthropology at Fordham University. Her research interests are urban anthropology, arts, gender, critical gender theory, war and violence, and globalization. Aseel's paper is titled The Hinderances of Making Art in Times of War, Two Cases from Amman. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sawalha.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I would like to thank everybody for this invitation and for the participation. It's odd, but we will do our best. I'll share. I have some slides that I will share later, and I will start. Today, I will trace the larger context behind recent trends in Amman cultural landscape. So this is part of a larger project that I have been working on about Amman, Amman art scene and the complexity of women, artists, refugees, and the changing of Amman's cultural landscape. Since the early 2000s, the conditions of contemporary Amman have been shaped by the government's neoliberal market-driven policies and the regional unrest that resulted in the influx of hundreds of thousands of refugees, two factors that changed the demographic layout of the city. In large part, they exacerbate the class hierarchy that aligns with the division of the working class in the dense eastern district of the city and the upper classes in the expanding areas to the west and the south. And here I will share the slide. We share the screen. I will share screen. Do you see my map?
Yes.
Yeah, it's yep, you see it.
Okay, great. Wanted to stay there. Okay, so this is a map that shows, how do you keep it stay?
There you are. We're there.
But I don't want it to move. It keeps moving.
Oh, probably don't click on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you want to point at it.
I don't want to, like, I want to keep it for now.
Okay.
Okay. In large part, they exist. So this is a map that shows all the waves of refugees that came to Amman. In the dense eastern district of the city and the upper classes in the expanding areas to the west and north. Despite this clear division of east-west, poor, affluent, and the wave of upper and middle class residents of the city is blurring. This essay provides exemplary instances of this group who initiate cultural projects with strong relationships to buildings and spaces in select older, humbler parts of the city. So all of these refugees are coming to the city, but I don't look at working class or poor refugees. I look at other kinds of refugees. I call them refugees with cultural capital. Paradoxically, their relationships to working class spaces reflect values of the local, yet those values echo trends that are beyond the local or even the regional just as they often end up affecting neighborhoods in the same patterns of gentrification. Drawing upon my long-term ethnographic research about the emerging art scene in Amman, this paper examines how middle and upper class young adults have forged ways to repurpose urban spaces into cultural science amid Amman's rapidly changing population and cityscapes. Based on participant observation and lengthy interviews with these new Ammanis or cultural activists and cultural entrepreneurs, while drawing on political economy and urban anthropology, I analyze their mobilization of cultural spaces as both a claim to the city and a claim to power rooted in the increasingly transnational and regional arts and cultural production. So I look at the Ammanis, these younger people in Amman, and the way they intersect with refugees, with cultural capital, and the way they change the city. On an April day in 2016, a wide range of artworks were neatly displayed on a white wall that appeared to be a street-level gallery space. Around 15 spectators gathered inside to view the art and talk to the artist, while others walked in and out of the glass doors that opened into the paved sidewalks. It looked like a regular gallery opening. Unlike other gallery openings in Amman, where servers walked around with small trays of soft drinks served in glasses, this time, 3 women artists, members of the art collective called Spring Sessions, who organized this event, stood at the entrance of the space and served guests traditional Arabic coffee in small paper cups. This event was not a typical art opening at a commercial gallery. This event was part of the activities of an art collective called the Spring Sessions or Jalsat al-Rabia. It was created, the Spring Sessions, it was created in 2014 by 2 young women artists who were already involved in a number of other art initiatives in Amman. Every year, the Spring Sessions organize a series of experimental art activities for 100 days that question the existing or the traditional art paradigms and engage with the community members and institutions. One of the challenges for this group is finding non-traditional sites and locations to hold their workshops and art shows. And what's interesting about this group, it's also temporary because they are only for 3 seasons of the year. They are only for 100 days of the year, not for the whole year. In 2016, the Spring Sessions took over a store owned by the Greater Amman municipality and curated a pop-up art show for 1 evening. After Amman was announced as the UNESCO's cultural capital of the Arab world in 2002, a street in Shmeisani neighborhood was dedicated for pedestrians and named Culture Street, Sharia Thaqafi. On this street, a large store owned by the municipality was supposed to function as an art gallery, but it never opened its doors to the public or for the art. Amman, the capital of Jordan, did not play a major. So the art sessions, they came and took over the space, opened it on their own, and did a gallery show there. So they were worried that the municipality will come and shut down the show. Amman, the capital of Jordan, did not play a major role in the regional production and circulation of art until the 2000s. In less than 2 decades, it transformed drastically to become a significant site of culture in the Arab region. Today, I trace some of the entwined reasons for these shifts, especially the effects of political economy and refugees, as the context of one strand of new cultural practices where art and urban spaces converge. A loose network of Western-educated young professionals, whom I call the new Ammanis, have participated in cultural projects based in buildings or neighborhoods formerly demarcated as declining or working class, and somewhat removed from the global or Western trends. These new Ammanis have consciously veered away from the normal path of careers in the dominant neoliberal economy and instead become agents in the creative, what I call the creative culture of Amman. Their new practices have affected the affordability and the significance of neighborhoods and everyday experiences of cities for both the working class residents and the elite. These areas became too expensive and beyond the means of long-term working class residents. However, they became attractive to the city's upper class seeking alternative lifestyle and the cultural events to patronize. Here I move to the regional and political change to give a background. In order to understand this shift, we have to trace the changes in the larger context, specifically the nation's political economy and its position in the war-torn region that pushed continuous waves of refugees into Jordan. These two factors changed the city's demographic composition, its physical layout, Amman's relationship to other regional cities that allowed Amman to take a regional role as a hub for the production and circulation of art. The implementation of neoliberal policies that resulted in the drastic change in the socioeconomic and political conditions in Jordan in the early 2000s played a major role in this shift. Since the early 2000s, the physical landscape of Amman started to change as the government implemented large-scale neoliberal market-driven policies. After the 1999, King Abdullah II implemented major economic reforms that resulted in the privatization of state-owned enterprise, opening the country for foreign investment. Signing agreements with international organizations such as the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the European Union. These neoliberal policies resulted in reducing government subsidies and in the privatization of large parts of the economy. Ilyana Abu Hamdi describes the neoliberal policies in Amman as numerous failed development projects or deregulated planning practices that produce a series of incomplete and poorly planned projects that instead of generating economic prosperity in the urban vitality, they exacerbated class disparities. Of course, my friend Najib Harani his work is really documents all of that. The Abdali project, launched in 2005, is a clear example of the effect of neoliberal policies on urban space and city dwellers' lives. With the approval and partnership of the government and private investors, both regional and multinational, the Abdali project appropriated existing commercial residential areas in the neighborhood in the areas of Abdali and Shmeisani, where the pop art show took place. The new Ammanis that I talk about, although I don't work on the Abdali project, but the new Ammanis I work with, while working close by to the Abdali project, they generally do not feel connected to the neoliberal project, which represents an aesthetic and ethics at odds with their view of the city. So they work on the margin of the although they are part of the neoliberal project, but they work on the margin of the neoliberal economy. These neoliberal policies that had huge effects on the everyday lives of Jordanians, regardless if they lived in rural or urban areas. The public sector is no longer a main venue of employment after a large percentage of jobs used to be in the military and the government. The decline in job opportunities outside the major urban centers forced many residents of rural areas and smaller towns to migrate to Amman in unprecedented numbers in search of job opportunities and education for their children. So people are migrating from rural areas on top of all of these people migrating from like from Syria, from the Gulf, from Iraq, from the returnees who came from Kuwait. So all of these people are moving to urban areas. So there is a shift between people who live in rural areas versus people who live in the city. So the population of Amman more than tripled in less than 20 years. So the internal migration combined with large waves of Iraqi Syrian refugees doubled the size of the population of Amman in less than 20 years. This sudden presence of these refugees meant that there was an urgent need for infrastructure such as housing, schools, water, sanitation, and transportation. The class divide in Amman is manifested geographically as the layout exacerbates the already existing socioeconomic hierarchies. The low and middle classes residents have long reside in the older, humbler eastern and northern districts, which have become more condensed with the increased population. Meanwhile, the wealthier districts expanded west and south to new developments, replete with wide streets, large malls, and gated communities. The older downtown area located in the lower valley once served as the marketplace for all classes until about the 1980s. Even those who lived in more affluent neighborhoods still drove to visit the downtown shopping district. As Amman's population increased, the number of residents in the east increased, without much expansion, making it more dense and compact. As the city expanded westward, more shopping districts opened and they stopped coming to the downtown. I'm going to skip this part.
Aseel, you have about 4.5 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to skip and talk about the new Ammanis. So I'm going to talk about, show some slides here. So I talk about I'm going to talk about this here. I'm talking about two characters here. One is an entrepreneur who started a cafe and a studio for photography. Her name is Linda Khouri. So she started a cafe called Fan wa Shai and a photography studio. She's Jordanian. She studied business, but she didn't like doing business. And she started this cafe and with a partnership with an Iraqi architect. And so the style of the cafe, according to her, when I interviewed her, it has a Baghdad style. That's what, that's the pieces of wood in the ceiling. Supposedly this is a Baghdad style. They did all the furniture, painted it by hand. And it became a center for art. So they do art exhibits. They are part of, and she does training for photography, for at refugee camps and all of that. And they do a photography. They organize a photography annual photography conference in Amman. The other, so this is how they describe it: the مساحة ثقافية خالية من التدخين, a cultural space free of smoking, and that's the cafe inside. The other, so most of the cultural institutions that I talk about, they are in the old part of Amman, where they renovated working class places that were occupied by working class people. So these are some of, this is Darat al-Funun, which is a whole cultural institution occupying a whole mountain. And these are the working class areas that they work with. And these are other examples of, so the other artist that I talk about is an Iraqi, well-known Iraqi artist. Her name is Raja Al-Qudsi. She's a well-known artist, Iraqi artist, who came to Amman in 2003. She cannot go back to Iraq. Her work is, she lost her studio, most of her work. They were set on fire in Baghdad. And some of her work is still at the Basra airport and Baghdad airport. She has large murals there, but she moved to Amman thinking that she and her husband will move to London, to immigrate to London, but they waited, they couldn't get the visa and all of that, but they ended up settling in Amman. And she became a member of the Jordanian Artists Association. So the fact that the presence of the Jordanian, the Iraqi artists changed, this is something I look at, the presence of the Jordanian Iraqi artists changed the cultural landscape of Amman, and this is the kind of art she does. One interesting thing when I talk to her, every time she buys sets of colors, she removes the color red. She never uses the color red in any of her art. So she started producing art again in Amman because she lost most of her art collection in Baghdad. So if you go to any art gallery,
1 minute. I'm sorry, Aseel.
yeah, that's fine. So the last section, I call it Baghdad in Amman. So most of the art galleries in Amman are showing Iraqi art. So this is an art gallery. It's called the Orfali Gallery that used to be in Baghdad. There was a famous gallery called Orfali Gallery. The cousin of the person who was there, who's opened the gallery in Amman in her living room and started showing art. They do a book, Iraqi book exhibit. They do different Iraqi shows, and that's another exhibit, Iraqi art exhibit in Amman. And this is also the Orfali Gallery, also showing different kinds, including having Japanese. I thought I like this photo. A Japanese artist doing wearing the Palestinian kuffiyas, doing Japanese music in an Iraqi gallery in Amman. So this is what's. So I will conclude by just reading the conclusion here. The Iraqi artist was forced to leave Baghdad after the looting and burning of her studio that was in Baghdad. She temporarily settled in Amman while waiting to immigrate. The Jordanian artist who got education in Beirut and working with Syrian and Palestinian refugees, they managed to create and produce art in Amman that is not Jordanian or Iraqi, but it's a regional kind of cultural production in the city. Although international conventions and treaties might cover the rights of refugees to education, health services, and housing, it is understandable that these rights are drafted to protect the most vulnerable at times of emergency. The refugees with cultural capital that I talk about here, the educated middle class or artists, usually they are excluded from those treaties and when we talk about refugees. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. A lot of information there, and I wish we had more time to go through these images, but we'll come back to them in the Q&A. Thank you, Aseel.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Shahjahan, Associate Professor of Higher Adult and Lifelong Education in our nationally renowned program, HAIL, at Michigan State University. His research interests are globalization of higher education, decolonizing the curriculum and pedagogy, temporality and embodiment in higher education, cultural studies, and D/anti/post-colonial theory. Riyad's paper is titled A Temporal Gaze Towards Academic Statelessness, Bangladeshi Mobile Scholar Perspectives. Without further ado, please, Professor Shahjahan. Let me just say before you get started, I am giving you each 20 minutes.
Okay.
Because we have one less speaker. And so we should be able to wrap up by noon and still have at least 25 or 30 minutes for discussion.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Hassan. Thank you for all of you who are here. This is actually my first time presenting at Muslim Studies conference. I felt this was one of the first conference themes that my work could fit. I hope you see some fit, though it might be a little bit challenging. This paper that I'm presenting on is coming from a larger study that looks at the interconnections between faculty life and temporality in an urban global south context. And for this today, I was looking at Dhaka, Bangladesh. And one of the themes that emerged when I was talking about temporality with all these different faculties from different institutions was the theme of mobility emerged in a lot of their career trajectories in terms of aspirations or in terms of their past experiences, as well as their daily concerns about their own life. So one of the things has been that academic mobility has been predominantly investigated as a resource for career development and progression of individuals, or as a contributor to national economic growth and advancement. And particularly in this paper, when I'm talking about academic mobility, I am basically trying to focus on faculty mobility that encompasses barriers, aspirations, or angst towards moving away from or returning to one's home country and or across national borders for either academic or personal reasons. So one of the things that's emerged through the literature on academic mobility is that there has been a focus on, as I mentioned, the economic context, but more recently, there has been discussions using more of a spatial lens as well as an affect lens to make sense of people, why they're moving across these different so-called spatial signifiers or national containers. But a temporal lens is missing, and that's what I'm hoping to contribute. But I'm hoping that my paper will also kind of complement the discussions that have been taking place in this conference by hopefully foregrounding the role of temporality in mobility. So a temporal lens is important because a migration decision-making process is not bound to a single moment, i.e. a rational calculated choice, but it's also folded in many other temporal categories, such as the past, future, and so forth, but also one's daily schedule, things like that. So academic mobility is rooted in the past, present, and future, particularly for academics as they engage in mobility movements. It's often connected to self-improvement, self-transformation, encompassing scholars' aspirations for personal, professional, or social progress in a transnational context. But also, as my narratives will highlight, academic mobility generates these temporal constraints or opportunities. In other words, it eats up time, or it feels like time is speeding up or slowing down or things like that. So it's important for us to think about academic mobility as not something that's only manifesting in space or amid affective forces, but also across times, which require further examination. So why Bangladesh? So Bangladesh represents one of the top exporting Asian migrant countries with a sizable transnational migration industry. And what I mean by a transnational migration industry is if you walk around or go around Dhaka, Bangladesh, you'll see lots of offices trying to talk about either study abroad, TOEFL test centers, immigration offices, things like that. That's all around. But also remittances is the second biggest contributor to the GDP of Bangladesh, of people sending money back home. But also in terms of academic mobility specifically, Bangladesh is at the periphery of the global economy of knowledge production. And this is tied to the colonial geopolitics of knowledge that often bolsters Bangladeshi academics and students' future aspirations to go elsewhere, to study abroad, given the lack of resources, as well as there are a lot of prestige and issues that are tied to getting a degree abroad. But also Bangladeshi academics represent one of the most highly skilled mobile labor that are in constant statelessness. And what I mean by that is in the academic career trajectories of many academics who become faculty, this idea of going abroad, either to get a PhD or to do their sabbatical, is an ongoing process and is part of the academic career ladder. And in doing so, what happens is many of them either go and settle and never return, but more recently, people have started to return for various reasons, even though it's in a country that's absent of any pull policies, like in India or other parts, they have these pull policies trying to pull their diasporic scholars back. That does not exist currently in Bangladesh. So that's a very interesting scenario of why do people return. So what I'm trying to do here is to provide a temporal lens to the discussion of academic temporal mobility. And here we draw on our previous work called Shomayscape, which is basically a complex temporal landscape of different temporal categories, constraints, agencies, and embody hybrid time. And by Shomai is basically a heuristic, a Bengali heuristic to signify things like to signify memories, present moments, feelings, a particular duration, or for a temporal engagement. We also draw on time work, which is a work written by Michael Flaherty, which is really another way of talking about temporal agency, whereby one is striving to control, manipulate, or customize one's or others' temporal experiences. And I also draw on affect theory that refers to collective emotions, responses, reactions that are both transpersonal as well as relational, but not solely located in the individual subject to make sense of the narrative that I'm about to share. As I mentioned earlier, this is part of a larger study that looks at academic life and temporality. And here I'm going to showcase 3 of those scholars' narratives that would help to juxtapose what it feels like for scholars who are trying to aspire to move, for those who are returning versus those who are immigrating. And most of it is based on these semi-structured interviews that cover different aspects of their academic life, such as roles and tasks, trajectory, work-life balance, perceptions of time, relationship and dilemmas with time, and the role of affect. So what I'm arguing in this paper is that a temporal lens showcases how academic mobility is temporally bound and facilitated by temporality before, during, and after movements across time, i.e. past, present, and future. And here I'm going to showcase 3 of these Bangladeshi scholars' narratives. One is Nahida, who's a young academic mother, who is a caretaker, who's seeking mobility to go abroad. The next is Ratul, who's a scholar who actually recently returned back to Bangladesh after working as well as doing studying in the global north, and Nobonita, who actually immigrated to Bangladesh and her Shomayscape. So first I'm going to talk about Nahida. Nahida is someone who exemplifies a mobility Shomayscape, which is whereby shows how affective entanglements with the future of others informs one time work for study abroad, resulting in a complex mobility Shomayscape. One study abroad Shomayscape here was a complex assemblage of past, present, and future, and affective relationality. In other words, responsibility and well-being of others. Nahida is a junior faculty member in business at a private university. She teaches at a separate university also and provides training for NGO. And this is very common among a lot of Bangladeshi academics. They're doing a number of work, not just that full-time work. She mentioned how she was financially responsible for her mother, who has some chronic disease, and her sister who lives in the village. And she is part of a family that does not, as she put it, have a male figure in the family because her father passed away a long time ago. So she grew up in a single mother family. And she talks about how work has been a big part of her since she was a teenager. And also she talks about how she's responsible for her children's education because she wants her children to have a particular holistic education that may not be supported by her husband. And now when we interviewed Nahida, this was a shift in her position and administrative leadership at her university. Such a shift had introduced precarity and increased angst with her career trajectory and daily life, but compounded with that precarity at work, felt financially responsible for her mother and older sister, given the absence of a male figure. And so she talks about how she felt stressed. And she felt stressed because of job security, but also she was stressed that she needed to go abroad to get a degree in order to secure more futurity in her present positions. She says, nowadays you cannot do a single thing without a PhD at a private university, and the bureaucracy, I'm not used to these things. So maybe a northern education would put me in a good place. And so this precarity at work, but precarity with what will happen to our children as well as our family, instigated this desire to study abroad, but even the aspirations to study abroad impacted her daily life every day. And so one of the things she talked about is how it impacted her sleep. She talked about these anticipatory constraints. She says, this year, I'm very stressed because I'm being very honest to you. Even if I get a chance to do a PhD, I know that I cannot take my kids. That's stress and everything. And I now have 2 children. I have a husband who might not be supportive. So we asked her, how do you deal with that? And she's talked about how she prays. We're instrumental to help her. She also meditates in the mornings before starting work. So in other words, Nahida's study abroad timescape or Shamayscape was entangled with the future of others. In other words, her mother's health, sister's well-being, children's education, but also her own future self, PhD abroad, job security. Nahida's time work with study abroad, i.e. applying abroad, was all about the future security of herself and family. This time work was thus constituted and refracted across the Shamayscape that reflected one's age, gender, futurity, past, and or relationality. Now, I want to move to the next narrative. Here, I'm going to demonstrate how a mobility Shamayscape manifests as one recalibrates one's temporal experience, i.e. life or career trajectory or values, by prioritizing and synchronizing to realign with an object, here a person or event. And here I'm going to share the narrative from Ratul. Ratul is a senior faculty member in biological sciences at a public university. And he received his doctorate and he did a number of postdocs in the global north. And when we asked him why he left, most of it was due to the lack of resources. The specialty field he had did not exist. So he went away, but he also returned. And so when we asked him, why did he return? He talked about how family was a major pulling force for him because he wanted to be in more close proximity to his family, but also his in-laws. So family became a major pulling force. But another thing that was very interesting is he talks about how he was pulled by his affective entanglements with the nation state or one's field. He said, so I figured that if I return to my country, at least I can pass things down to my students. And even if one student learns from me, that means I have built up one student who will be an honest person. This was the main reason why I returned home. But it's not just the pull. He was also being pushed to come back. And that was to do things with not having the relational resources he might need to succeed abroad, like networks, being part of particular clubs, being part of the ethnic group or so forth. Okay. But what was very interesting about Ratul, unlike Nahida, who's trying to go abroad, him returning, and this is something we don't see or talk about, is the time maps he was bringing with him from abroad that he applied at work. He said, I had been in Japan for 11 years. I've been in research for a long time. I do know how to do things correctly. The main thing is that people do things abroad, and when they come back, they just leave everything abroad and they just get used to our culture. But in my case, I don't want to do that. And here what he's specifically talking about is one of the things he's learned, or a temporal discipline he opted for, was the priority towards research versus other things. And he brought that to his work. And so he does research when many Bangladeshi faculty do not feel that urge to do research because of the Riyad structure, things like that, but he did. So this is very interesting how mobility also shapes what time maps we bring with us as we move from one place to another. So in other words, Ratul's narrative shows how pulling back is much more complicated and involves a mobility Shamayscape tied to temporal continuities, discontinuities with space, relationships to people, and past experiences and memories. So in his Shamayscape, you see the past, relationality, other experiences, but also the futurity of others, i.e. students, the country's research capacity. Next, we move on to another narrative, and here I'm going to talk about those who decide to immigrate. Here, Nabonita's mobility Shamayscape consisted of colonial history, structural constraints of religion, borders, immigration, and affective entanglement. Nabonita engaged in time work by crossing the temporal boundaries of cultures, regions, and nation states to ultimately sync her life with her partner. So Nabonita is a full professor in archaeology, and her partner is also an academic, and they decided not to have children. She comes from a different South Asian country and is from a Hindu background. So she talked about how in her career trajectory, this shuttling between these two nation states, and at that time when she was shuttling, there was no borders between India and Bangladesh, but she still had some relational constraints that came from trying to marry into a Muslim family. And so she talks about how in her timescape, the family and societal suspicion of Islam as a religion, Bangladesh as an Islamic nation, and her partner as a Muslim is fueled by these temporal logics of history in South Asia, where conflicts between Muslims and Hindus have monopolized time, and something to resist rather than open oneself up to, like love in the global north. So one of the things that's interesting is she talks about how she may be crossing borders, but beyond the crossing borders because of Rav religion, she also had to cross temporal social cultural practices. In that time, she even though at her movement, there weren't these borders, she had to go cross these other borders, such as cultural boundaries, food habits, everything, religious boundary, political boundary, according to her. But also the whole immigration process was very much, language was a big part of her mobility showmanship, because she talked about how she had to engage in a lot of time work to prioritize the adoption and understanding and application of Bangla as a language. And she talked about how she had to spend many years, so she had to take break from her academic trajectory in order to then be able to work in the Bangladeshi university. So in other words, Nabonita's mobility showmanship is not only crossing these so-called national borders, but it's also about crossing temporal borders across cultures, regions, nation states, partners' life, languages, South Asian past, present, and future. So with that, I'm going to conclude that academic mobility starts with everyday time work, decisions, choices, and/or rationales. Mobility is not a single temporal event, but is folded with other temporal categories. And it's interesting to reflect on the differences in time work and these participants' mobility showmanship. So for Nahida, we see how futurity was most salient in terms of her mobility showmanship, whereas for Ratul and Nabonita, given their attachments to family, but others, it was more about the past, how the past was so much creeping up into their showmanship. But that's important that mobility, when we think of mobility, we often think about these geographical containers that we are passing through, but we're not considering the time, what Cross-Stephens would talk about, the aerographies, or the air, atmospheric, and temporality is that atmospheric space, and that it begins temporality in people's life before or after physical spatial movements. So temporal agency with mobility according to these narratives was not individual nor economic, but tied to a lot of affective entanglements, i.e. loved ones or precarity. And with that, I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riyad. Loud applause, very original research. And now we're going to shift to something a little bit different from the fieldwork of Aseel and Riyad to literary studies related to statelessness, with a presentation by Ms. Hanan Ali, a PhD candidate in the Department of English at Michigan State University. The title of her dissertation is The Representation of Dispossession in the Diasporic Literature of the Middle East and the Maghreb. And her paper today is titled The Stateless Other in Literature of the Arab Diaspora. Hanan, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll do my best to stick to that. I think I'm good. Okay. Hello, everyone. I've chosen that particular topic because I've noticed that in the diasporic literature of the Middle East, there is a preoccupation with Palestine as the absent nation. And this is what I chose to work on today to present to you. The figure of the dispossessed Palestinian, the stateless other, is a haunting presence in the diasporic literature of the Middle East. Palestinians without Palestine is how Tal Adnan puts it succinctly in the Arab Apocalypse. For this paper, I will look into the representation of the stateless other in Tal Adnan's Sit Mary Rose. The novel engages with the contemporaneous Lebanese civil war. Though complex and involved multiple factions and foreign countries with some shifting allegiances over its course, the war was primarily between the Christian Lebanese militias and Palestinian forces, mainly from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, with the Palestinian refugees' right to exist in the Lebanese state coming to the foreground. The novel evokes the true events of the abduction, torture, and murder of Mary Rose Bolos by the Christian militia. Bolos was a Christian woman originally from Syria who taught deaf mute children and worked to provide social services to Palestinian refugee camps before and during the Lebanese civil war, engendering her murder. I argue that the novel underlines our ethical obligations to the other and highlights the value of alterity, all of which I believe is relevant for conceptualizing contemporary refugee crises within Arab and non-Arab countries. This paper is informed by theorization of dispossession by Judith Butler and Athena Athanasiou, and relationality to alterity by Emmanuel Levinas and Jacques Derrida. Mary Rose, the main character in the novel, is first captured and interrogated by the Christian militia for crossing the line that divides the city into two enemy camps by going to the Muslim side. That's her crime, her immediate breach. That breach, however, bespeaks a political transgression of being a Christian, unapologetically sympathetic to the Palestinians, or those who have lost everything, as she puts it herself. She continues to serve through her work as a teacher. She continues to serve the Palestinians through her work as a teacher in the camps through the war. And in so doing, she breaks from what Adnan calls the tribalism of the Arab world. What critics Thomas Foster and Olivia Harrison concede is analogous to what Edward Said calls in secular criticism a filiative logic of nationalism grounded in feelings of tribal solidarity. The novel evokes the complex ways in which social class, as well as political, national, and religious identifications, partly the legacy of the French mandate for Lebanon and Syria, have coalesced into a kind of tribalism that has fueled antagonisms that eventually led to the war. For the filiative communities formed in Lebanon fell largely along religious lines: Christian Maronites, Shiites, Sunnis, and Druze, along with Palestinian refugees and Syrian immigrant workers, largely classified as Muslims. These lines have been reinforced by the French colonial mandate for Syria and Lebanon following the partition of the Ottoman Empire after the end of World War I. Upon granting Lebanon independence, the French mandate distributed seats in the Lebanese parliament. The president was to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister is Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies is Shia Muslim. The Christian elite, privileged by the French and influenced by French acculturation, had largely identified themselves with the French and aligned with the West politically, rather than with Arab and political concerns, rather than with Arab culture and political concerns. The dispossession of thousands of Palestinians of their home country since 1948, and later of their temporary refuge in Jordan after Black September, led to the residents in Lebanon as refugees. This meant a drastic increase in the Muslim population, which underlined the inadequacy of the distribution of political power that had somewhat served the country up to this point, and fueled dissatisfaction among the Muslims with the pro-Western state politics. Cutting across these deep-rooted filiative ties were newly born affiliative political identifications, such as leftist and pan-Arabist parties, which were large legacy of Western colonialism, American imperialist agenda, and Israeli Zionism. The novel also evokes the ways in which French acculturation has further instilled the Lebanese Christians' affective identification with the European colonizers and informed their attitudes toward non-Christian Lebanese and other Arabs, further solidifying these filiative ties. For instance, Christian Lebanese businessmen, who the narrator tells us have lived, worked, and made fortunes in Gulf countries, would always say how much they, quote, hate the Arabs, unquote. In a flashback during her capture, Marie Rose remembers how Munir, a Christian Maronite with whom she had a love affair when they were 16, and later a militiaman and one of her executioners, used to think of himself as European and could not believe that she was Arab because she was so modern, further consolidating the binary at work. He used to tease her about loving Arab music and listening to Kulthum while he was listening to Chopin. As a kid, he identified himself with the crusader Frederick Barbarossa. Sid Marie also recalls how at the Jesuit school they attended, Munir, together with other Christian boys, were led by the French priests to a procession dressed in white tunics with crosses on their chests and backs, just like the Crusaders. Mary Rose, a child then, used to make fun of him and tell him that he looked ridiculous. When Mary Rose told him, "You come from here, you are not a foreigner. You don't come from France or England. You could never be a Crusader." Munir looked confused, hurt, and then asked, "What am I going to become then?" Ironically, Munir becomes the Crusader Mary Rose told him he could never be, by joining the Christian militia and participating in what the female narrator calls a class war to eradicate the poor, the unprivileged, and the dispossessed. And it is exactly in terms of a crusade, bred of the inextricable fear and hate of the vilified other, that the female narrator views the war. She says, "The crusade, which I never thought was possible, has in fact taken place, but it's not really religious. It's a part of a larger crusade directed against the poor. They consider the poor to be vermin they think will eat them. They fight to block the tide of those who have lost everything, or those who have never had anything and have nothing to lose." The novel thus suggests how the Lebanese Civil War reproduces what Olivia Harrison adequately calls the colonial structures of affiliation instilled in the protected Christian minority of the Levant, where the Muslim Palestinian figures as the enemy outsider. Though the war renders the entire Lebanese population precarious to different kinds of dispossession, such precarity is inequitably distributed. The Christian side, for instance, thanks to modern artillery and powerful connections, has remained less precarious than the less powerful, unarmed Palestinian refugees. And as such, the war has become what the female narrator calls carnage of the new grass, with the expected outcome that the wretched and downtrodden are, quote unquote, terrorized. A body seems to fall every second. Syrian construction migrant workers who are not part of the war and work primarily for Christian businessmen are subjected to the most brutal butchering in retaliation for any loss of Christian lives. As the narrator puts it, they get massacred in construction sites and sent to the morgue in packages of 20 or 30. The Syrian workers in that context become a category of citizens that cannot be integrated politically, which reduces them to bare life and subjects them to elimination, as Agamben would say, in line with the state of exception. The novel's identification with the plight of the refugees and advocacy for upholding our ethical obligations toward them are evident in the trial scenes of the main character by the Christian militiaman. When accused of treason, Marie Rose states she doesn't consider Palestinians an enemy, but rather brothers who, like other Arabs in the region, share the same history and culture. In so doing, she strikes at the limitations of the filiative ties forged in Lebanon by laying claim to a more expansive pan-Arab cultural and historical affiliation. When Munir refers to Palestinians' arrogance as grounds for violence against them, saying, "You forget their arrogance, they behaved like the masters. They walked around brandishing their arms in broad daylight. They were the ones who asserted themselves." The host guessed master-slave binary at work in Munir's logic is countered by Mary Rose's response that the true provocation is actually the Christians' indifference to Palestinians' dispossession and their alliance with their enemies, the Israelis. Here's what she said. Because they were on vulnerable ground. Someone killed their poets while you were off hunting, while you're off driving around like wild men on the mountain roads, mimicking a Monte Carlo auto rally. Someone bombed their camps while you were out dancing. People bargained with their history in the halls of the UN, while you secretly armed yourselves with the aid of their invaders, so that one day you could stab them in the back. In that speech, Marie Rose is actually placing emphasis on the responsibility for the other, the stateless other, that who lies out of the closely knit filiative fabric, evoking Levinas's argument in Entre nous for the responsibility for the other. According to Levinas, we are bound to the other by responsibility. That responsibility cannot be evaded. Responsibility for the other, he says, who must be fed and clothed. My substitution for the other, my expiation for the suffering of the other, and no doubt for the wrongdoing of the other person. The responsibility for the other, according to Levinas, holds true, regardless of how he views me. In other words, the relationship with the other is marked by what he calls an asymmetry of intersubjectivity, or as he puts it, what the other is with respect to me, that is his own business. For me, he's above all, the one I am responsible for. Munir and the rest of the militiamen on whose side he fights do not see themselves as owing any responsibility, owing the Palestinians any responsibility or even recognition. Munir actually resorts to a rights discourse grounded in citizenship to the Lebanese nation state, saying, it's our country, we are at home here. While this discourse not only absolves itself of ethical responsibility to the Palestinian other, absolves itself of its ethical responsibility of the Palestinian other, Mary Rose sets such responsibility as a moral imperative, asking, and since when does being at home put you above morality? The Phalangist proprietary claim to the country assumes the prerogative to decide who could exist in the country. This contention draws attention to, recalls Derrida's argument of hospitality, where he says that the law of hospitality is both enabled and governed by a set of limiting laws. So while the sovereignty of the Lebanese nation state has made extending hospitality to the Palestinian refugees possible, it is now the very same grounds for withholding that hospitality and thus deeming them out of place. Within the context of conflict, those out of place are subjected to extermination, such as what Butler and Athanasi would call the violent logic of dispossession, whereby the propriety of speciality and subjectivity are reaffirmed by dispossessing those who are deemed out of place. The claim to the Lebanese citizenship assumes also the right of allowing others being at a very basic level, of granting them what Levinas would call ontological space. And this is directly in conflict with what Levinas theorizes where it comes to our ethical obligation to the other. We, according to Levinas, do not own our ontological space. That is to say, we are not free to decide who enters our ontological space. We are not free to decide who addresses and to whom we must answer and submit. Our sociality, according to Levinas, is something that lies beyond our control. And it is this that makes us answerable to the other. And this is what we owe the other, regardless of what I am to the other, or what we are to the other. Or as Butler would call, the other calls and I answer. So to Levinas, the whole point is this answerability is a condition of our sociality. We do not, this is our ethical obligation. It's an obligation that we cannot evade. And we are, the fact that we are in our country or in a certain ontological space does not entitle us to decide who enters this ontological space. Mary Rose's affiliation with the Muslim Palestinian is
Hanan, sorry, 3.5 minutes, just so you know. Okay.
Okay, is grounded in a belief, in a firm belief in the value of alterity, in direct opposition to affiliative structures seeking its eradication. To her, the Palestinian other offers a mean to go outside the limits of the self and beyond the extremely limited and limiting onto epistemological norms of belonging and intelligibility offered by affiliative ties. Their mere presence and demand of recognition challenge Arabs to reflect on their values. Here's how she puts it. The Palestinians, they represent a new beginning. The Arab world is infinite in terms of space and infinitely small in its vision. It's made up of sects and subsects, ghettos and communities, worked by envy, rotten, closed back on themselves like worms. This world must be aired, its stiffness must be eased. For once, the history of the Middle East is not of the wandering of the Christian. It is that of a nomad carrying his tribe in himself. It is of a man alone, uprooted, pursued. They are attempting to break down your values, and in the process are breaking down their necks. Her view here is very much in line with Derrida's argument that the foreigner always presents the host with the gift of enlightenment. This is the value of alterity. This is what alterity does. The other, Derrida reminds us, being a foreigner, questions the authority of logos, drawing people's attention to that which they could not see from their own positionality as natives, as if to remind them of what ought to be obvious to the blind. In other words, the foreigner, the recipient of hospitality, like the stranger who took Socrates' place in Plato's dialogue, presents his host with the gift of enlightenment. To Marie Rose, the enlightenment the Palestinian could offer is healing the Arab sectarian and subsectarian world, figured here as an abject body politic. And we have to skip that so to sum up, the novel, Atala Adnan's novel provides insights into our ethical obligations to the other, despite the alterity, and because of the alterity, highlights the value of the other. I believe these insights are still relevant for conceptualizing contemporary refugee crises, like the Syrian refugee crisis, for example, amidst a newly mobilized Islamophobia in Western contexts and a persistent sectarianism in Arab contexts, still rendering the dispossessed even more precarious.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I had to cut out a chunk, but
yeah, that's fine. We'll get to any questions in a moment. I'm going to begin briefly by kind of some general comments, trying to pull these three. Oh, my time's up. All right. Okay. So yeah, so I think
I had a couple of minutes then.
No. Leave them to me. So the papers, I think, are convince you that there are some important linkages here. I think one of the major points that is made in all three papers, even though they deal with distinct situations and different types of narratives, is the formation of new global identities and communities shaped in large part by displacement and realignment that troubles the nation state paradigm. So I think that what we're seeing in all three papers, whether it be from a Arab novel such as Atal Adnan's Sit Marie Rose, or the fieldwork of Aseel and Riyad in their respective contexts, is this kind of troubling of the nation state paradigm and these new global identities or communities. I'm thinking of them in terms of postmodern subjectivities in which statelessness or ambivalence towards national belonging enables creative alternatives that are generated by the tragedy of statelessness or marginalization or peripheralization. So it's this kind of, Cornel West has this phrase that he uses, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase it. I don't know the exact quotation, but he talks about transforming conjunctural crises into opportunities. And so there's this conjuncture right in our moment. And I would say that in the Middle East in particular, but certainly to some degree in Asia as well, the way that we continue to contend with the consequences of the end of the Cold War. And that this to me is very much like the Arab Spring is part of that. And to some degree, Atal Adnan foresees this in some of her work, the Arab Apocalypse book-length poem. Now, if we look more specifically at the papers, how do these creative opportunities emerge, and how are they generative of new postmodern subjectivities? In Aseel's work, her discussion of Annan's cultural scene centered on new Ammanis and the rise of arts entrepreneurs at the center of Amman, in the oldest historic parts of the city. And I would say like the dilemmas or the paradoxes of that kind of gentrification that goes along with growth, expansion, and accommodation. And so I think there's a great moment in the paper when Aseel comments on these new Ammanis being both part of neoliberalism in Amman and in Jordan, and at the same time, somehow in tension with that the projects they're encouraging or beneficiaries of are also reliant on that neoliberal privatization, deregulation, and the kind of economic opportunities that it provides to individuals, as opposed to the state formation and the public sector, which is more focused on a kind of social welfare network. In Riyad's paper, I think these postmodern subjectivities, or if you want to think about them a little bit differently, as these global identities and communities, is viewed through the question of temporality and signified in his concept of chameau-escapes, through which he understands the diversity of narratives of academic Bangladeshis and their mobility. And so this, I think, is really key, is that there's not a homogenization of the community as such. In fact, one wonders if in these three narratives, the narratives of, let me find my notes, the narrative or the case studies of Nahida, Ratul, and Nabanita, if in fact what we're seeing is a kind of fragmentation of community rather than a cohesiveness, and that what this, even though there might be a sharing of the chameau-escape idea, that it can't be reduced to one thing, that it's multiplying all the time through these diverse experiences. And so it would, one doesn't want to generalize too much about the cultural unity, or that this is some kind of a community of Bangladeshi academics who are propelled to seek education outside of their home country because of the peripheralization of knowledge and opportunity. But at the same time, again, this is again that paradox, is that, and he points to it, that they are highly skilled. So there's this pull to bring them back in, because what they deliver on their return to their home country in Bangladesh is something new, something that's not there, something that and it can only exist in them. It's not as though an NGO project from the West or a foreign professor going there and spending a semester can bring it there. It's like something that it's embodied in that temporal experience and the time work that they do in order to in a sense, emancipate themselves from both the push and the pull. And in Hanan's paper, we see this. I mean, it might be a stretch, but I think we can say that Sit Marie Rose represents similarly a kind of alternative subject. She neither belongs to the Christian community, the Syrian community, or the Lebanese community. She's not Palestinian. She's not deaf mute, even though she works within the community in the school of the handicapped youth, and her in-betweenness, let's say, or her outsiderness is what others her in many ways, but the other of the novel is certainly the Palestinians in Lebanon. And so the way the novel, in my view, and the way that Hanan has presented it, is that a narrative of a certain kind of dispossession that centers on the way that we relate to the dispossessed. And what, I mean, Levinas offers one paradigm. I'm not entirely convinced that his model of the other works in this case, but we can see how at the personal level, what Marie Rose represents, if Levinas and the other, what we have is then Sit Marie Rose and the Palestinians. And so there's a kind of analogy or homology between these two, that Marie Rose can see their faces. And this is a fundamental thing for Levinas, is like the face of the other. And so, and we can complicate the reasons why someone like Levinas or even Judith Butler might be thinking about this from their perspective as Jewish academics in the diaspora and their vexed relationship with Zionism. But if we take that model, and because like Levinas has no ideas or thoughts about Marie Rose or about Lebanon when he writes this, so we're taking a paradigm that's completely othered itself and applying it to a situation. And so we might ask, to what degree, as I did in the first question, the first panel I asked, like, do we have our own paradigms, whether we want to call them Muslim paradigms or paradigms of the global South or Arab or South Asian paradigms? And we can see that what's generative in these papers, I think, is an attempt to struggle with that. Like, how do we get outside of the Western optic and start to think about what we're creating in these vexed, paradoxical, and contradictory positions that we all occupy. I think many of us, all of our presenters so far, I would say, occupy those positions. So I'll stop there, and I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to moderate this panel, and we'll take questions now. Jyotsna, I see your hand.
Hi, this was a great panel, and I have a question for Hanan. I thought that was a really interesting paper, and I really am glad you brought Levinas, because I haven't read him for many years, so I used to really find him very productive. So I think his idea of this, the face of the other and how we treat the other, and I think you read it nicely in your novel, I think that's a kind of ethical idea, right? He's proposing an ethics. And so my larger question as a fellow literature person is, so how do literary works work with ethics? Do they have a special status in laying out ethics, in promoting ethics, in engaging us? And kind of who is the we? So, it's a sort of related question. I hope it's not too sort of convoluted.
I think I get your question, but it seems like a little challenging to try to see ethics. I personally, I think literature definitely engages with ethics. There's a stance that that Ital Adnan's work takes, a very clear ethical stance. Like, I was surprised some of the criticism written about the novel talk about like how there is indeterminacy. Maybe there are innovative like narrative techniques, but you cannot read Adnan's work and think that the ethics are not clear. I think there are all sorts of ways in which the text articulates that. That's like part of a larger chapter. But I think she also complicates Levinas. Like she pushes, I think, probably deliberately, because she does use language from Levinas. Like she talks about the other and the face of the other. And the moment a militiaman orders her execution, is announced by the priest saying she has no face. And that means it's a sanctification of violence against her. When he said she has no face, that was when she was murdered. So I think she does push against Levinas in more than one way. Levinas says that I owe the other what I owe for what he is, which is great. But he said that this is in spite of my survival, in spite of self-preservation. So he doesn't engage with that. I think Tal Adnan makes the thriving of the self, the survival, pending on the survival of the other. Like killing the other leads inevitably in her work to the destruction of the self. So it becomes self-annihilation. And I think this is one main way in which she pushes against Levinas in that way. We're more interconnected than that.
Thank you. That was very.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And the other questions, anybody have other questions for Aseel or Riyad? Maybe I'll take advantage. Aseel, did you feel like when you're doing your fieldwork in Amman, and at one point you referred to gentrification, and what kind of, I mean, you have a class analysis that kind of looks up, right, rather than towards the working class, and I'm wondering if you know, quite often you have people who are like historically who are immigrants who have come and moved into neighborhoods all over the world and, you know, created those neighborhoods and contributed to them, whether it be like the Lebanese in Brooklyn or, you know, Japanese and Chinese on the Pacific Coast, Koreans. So I'm wondering if you're seeing like any signs of like hostility or both to the idea of gentrification, like taking these old homes and buildings and converting them into art spaces, which have very limited use, but are obviously beautiful contributions to the city, and that problem.
Yeah, this is, thank you. Thank you also for your previous comments. It is a very interesting question about gentrification because I look at it from both perspectives. This is the first time I work with the elite of the city because all of my previous work was the other side of the city, because before I worked with Palestinian refugees, in fact, in Amman, but this time I'm looking at the other side of the city. So it's really a different experience to see the city from the eyes of the elite, which is a whole other way of seeing it. So at one point, one day I was at one of those art galleries, and I was talking to the people in the gallery, and I said, "How about gentrification?" And they said they are so much aware of it, and they asked me, "It's like, why don't you have a workshop for us about gentrification?" So, which was really interesting. So we sat at an art gallery and we talked about gentrification, and we couldn't come up with a word in Arabic for gentrification. So we started talking about al-gentrification in Arabic. And so they are, from the perspective of the elite, they are aware of it and they know it. And they talked about it from a gender perspective. They wanted a little bit of gentrification so they can walk without wearing head covers. They can walk at night. They can do all of these things, but they are conscious that they are gentrifiers of these neighborhoods. From the perspective of the working class people who are living in these neighborhoods, they see them as foreigners, which is so strange because these are mostly Palestinian elite. The gentrifiers are Palestinian upper class mostly, who grew up also in Kuwait. Most of them, they are the returnees who came back to Jordan after the first Gulf War. When Saddam invaded Kuwait, they came back. So these are the elite that I'm talking about mostly, and some of them are Jordanian background, but mostly they are the Palestinian elite. So these are the gentrifiers. They carry out their conversations mostly in English, not in Arabic. And so when they are walking around in working class, mostly Palestinian neighborhoods, they are viewed as foreigners. And I went with them to look at other neighborhoods that are not quite gentrified. The kids, they follow them and to look at them because they see them as foreigners. They don't see them as locals, which is really interesting. So there is a tension because they see them as outsiders. And so the tension is really, it's a class tension, but they are also bringing in, and some of them are so conscious of it. It's like we only buy things from the small shops. We try to bring things to the schools. So they are unlike the gentrifiers in New York who are totally oblivious to the gentrification process because I want to do it. They are more conscious of it, which is really interesting. They know that they are changing the neighborhood. They want to go and buy hummus and falafel from Abu Ahmed's little shop. They want to use the service. They want to use the little grocery store because they are conscious of the neoliberal projects. They don't want to go to the Safeway supermarket. They want to go to the downtown and buy things from the locals. So it's very different from the gentrification in the West. So they are conscious gentrifiers, but the locals they see them as foreigners because they dress differently, they speak differently, but the relationship is not, like we cannot copy the way it's done in the West, which is interesting. And they are aware of even the concept of the right to the city. They talk about the right to the city. They talk about all of these things, but they are entrepreneurs because they want to make some money and they want to live outside the bubble of the neoliberal economy, but they are on the margin of it. And that's my argument. And going back to your point about trying to get away from the nation state, the nation state is failing in Jordan for everybody. And so they are creating the regional networks, global, but also regional networks. And they are conscious of creating South-South relationships, which is fascinating because they want to invite artists from the global South, and they are conscious of those debates. So they see themselves as part of the leftist global network, which is an interesting, they are the elite, but they see themselves as part of the global left.
I know exactly what you're talking about. And I think that as academics, we sometimes find ourselves in that
circle.
Yeah. So Kyle, I see your hand. Please type your question into the Q&A if it's not too much trouble. And I have no way of unmuting you or allowing you to speak in this modality, as far as I know. It's not in my power anyway. So Kyle Craig, I see your hand up as an attendee. And any other attendee, please. So I think he did that. Let's see. Oh, no problem. Okay, so while he's doing that, let me ask another question for Riyad. If I was interested in something you came up with towards the end is you sort of spatialize time. You talked about atmospheric space. Time is atmospheric space. I'm just kind of wondering about that. It's like, like is it? Do we have to kind of go there always when we're talking about mobility? In the end, do we always have to then somehow, I mean, like, you have this idea of the space-time continuum, right? Like this sort of science fiction idea, or physics, it's like, but you're really dealing with this kind of social reality. And so this idea of atmospheric space, so you're like spatializing time, like you're thinking of time as this atmospheric thing, but so I'm wondering if you just want to like refute that idea that you're spatializing time, or if you want to elaborate on why you go there.
I think I might take the question in a completely different direction, if that's okay. When you talked about
no,
this,
you're not allowed to do that. Go ahead.
But this whole point about the nation state ontology is something I think a lot about. I mean, all the categories that we're using today to discuss the whole notion of migration, displacement is tied to nation state categories, Palestinian. I mean, if you go to and I talk about this, if you go to the fauna of Palestine or in Lebanon, none of the fauna will call themselves Lebanese or Palestinian. These are human-made categories, right? That also reproduce Westphalian assumptions of sovereignty, right? So in many ways, what I'm trying to talk about in terms of temporality is to shift away from this idea of a spatial, a material spatial thing, but something that nation states are something that we carry with us, even if we are not physically located there, right? And that's what I mean by atmospheric, is that, when we talk about diasporas or things like that, they're not physically maybe there, but they're carrying it with them, right? When I listen to Hanan's deliberation about the novel, to me a novel, and I teach cultural studies here at MSU, is a powerful cultural artifact that to some extent is a very temporal critique of how we could imagine ourselves if we were to interact with the other. And here, in a specific historical trajectory. So popular culture is all about that, is about asking the existential questions, what if, and how would we? And so going back to the question of ethics is super important in terms of looking at cultural artifacts. But to go to your question about space and time, a showmyscape is something that is grounded in space, because when we deliberate what a showmyscape is, temporality is salient based on a particular material context. So for some people, the past is very salient versus the future, right? But that's not tied to, for instance, just airy-fairy, but it's because of a particular material condition that they're living in, right? So the example of Nahida versus Ratul are quite different, because the contextual and what's called the lifespan that they're in is quite different in their career trajectories. And so the futurity became more important. That doesn't mean the past is not informing it, but the futurity was what was salient in her narrative, versus Ratul was more talking about the past and the past drawing him back, family, things like that. And similarly with Nabonita, when she's talking about colonial histories, and this divide between Muslims and Hindus is something that is of the past that continues today, but was much more salient than, say, for the others. So I don't know if I answered your question, Salah, but I think I would complicate the notion of a nation state as being just a spatial signifier, but also an affective category that we're always carrying with us, and it's not necessarily geographically situated in one place.
Very good. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, people do talk about nation time for sure. And
yes,
I think
yes.
that, okay, Kyle, can you unmic yourself? It looks like you have a microphone beside your name. Talking is permitted, it says.
Yeah.
There you go. You're on. You're on.
Okay, I was typing just in case it didn't happen, but thank you all for these incredibly rich and also really complimentary papers. I think the panel actually went together really nicely. My question is for Professor Aseel. I was wondering, I'm curious about this new Ammani identity and how many of your interlocutors, they come from refugee communities across different generations, be they in the early 2000s or all the way back to 48. And as they're constructing this new Ammani identity, how do they place themselves within the broader history of Amman? And additionally, how does the new Ammani identity emerge in relation to other homelands, be they Jordan or Palestine or Iraq? And I was also curious to know a little bit more about how class plays out internally among your interlocutors, in addition to in relation, between cultural producers in Amman or in Webde and the broader community. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks.
Normally we would wrap up at 12:30. Mohammed, this would be the last question, but we'll let Aseel take her time to answer, and then we get a break, right?
Yeah, it's actually the big lunch break. So we only have 45 minutes. So, but yeah, a couple of minutes will be fine. Thank you.
I'll try to be quick about it, although it's a major question, Kyle. This is a huge question because lots of people, especially my older friends in Amman, they hate this identity. They attack me for claiming that there is a Ammani identity especially older ones. So the Ammani identity, it's an elite identity. It's an elite identity for people who are in their 20s to 40s, basically. And because those are the ones who don't want to be identified as Palestinian or Jordanian. So it's because there is always the tension that Palestinian and Jordanian. So these are the ones who are trying to go beyond the national identity. And that goes back to, and who has the luxury to go beyond the national, that Palestinian-Jordanian divide. So it's the ones who are able to do that. So it's mostly the elite, the ones who are involved in those debates, like the cultural producers. So those mostly educated in Western schools, educated either in for college, their college education is done in the West, involved in producing art or cultural kind of production, but not mostly not, like they could be educated in, got some education in a Jordanian university, studied art, but got involved later. But those are the ones who would stay. They will tell you the name of where their original family came from. But the ones who went to the elite schools, private schools in Amman, they will tell you an Ammani, and that's it. And they put a full stop there, and they don't want to elaborate where they are originally from. So it's an elite identity, and it's a younger kind of crowd. If you talk to their families, which I did, their families, they don't identify as Ammanis. They go back to their places of origin. I'm from Irbid, or I'm from a village near Jerusalem, or I'm from a village or Jaffa or Haifa. So they go to the places of origin. So it is a class identity. It's an identity associated with cultural production, and it's connected with all of these associations. And I know, Kyle, you work on art, but it's a different kind of art that you work on. I don't know how they identify the artists that you work with. So most probably we need to talk about that. So maybe they have a different way of talking about it, because like people who graduated from work, who come from working class background, they immediately they give you give the background. So I don't know.
Thanks for that question, Kyle, and thanks for the answer. We're going to stop here, and we'll take a break, and we reconvene, I believe, at 1:15 for the keynote presentation by Rochelle Davis, professor at Georgetown University, and the title of her paper is Studying Displacement and Statelessness in the World Today. And I hope you will all return and encourage your friends and colleagues to come and hear Rochelle's presentation beginning at 1:15. So thanks again.